A cloaked human battleship revealed itself, and the throne room fell into silence. The certification said disarmed. Nobody in the Sovereign Hall had thought to ask it a new question in 8 years. High Warden Cecily Vren held the document at the lectern, careful not to smudge the 8-year-old ink. The Sovereign Hall of Dolvin Reach was a sunken amphitheatre carved into fused glass, the floor a single uninterrupted slab that no record had ever logged opening. 40 delegations watched from tiered seats as Vren's four-fingered hand steadied the paper. Her left eye, the one she'd replaced with polished sensor glass after a mining accident 27 years prior, caught the light and threw it back cold. Disarmed, she read aloud. Classification confirmed, year 08, Calder Reach survey. Status, non-participant seat, reclassification effective upon vote. I move to formalize immediately. Vren set the certification down. Her hand moved to her collar, the fused obsidian beads, one for each year of her wardenship, 27 beads total. She touched it before every ruling, the gesture that preceded the decisions no one reversed. All in favor, she said. The amphitheatre held its breath, not because a reclassification vote was unusual. The sovereignty voted to demote or elevate species constantly, the machinery of galactic hierarchy grinding forward with mechanical precision. But because Senna Okafor sat 3 rows back from the center, and Okafor had never let a motion pass without objection. Delegate Hask of the Pelurin raised his primary arm immediately. The Pelurin had voted to demote the compact 4 times already. One more was ritual. Beside him, Sarmal of the Torvan, her secondary eyes cycling through their agreement pattern, raised both manipulators. Then Vex Shana of the Coiled, her scaled form rippling with what might have been satisfaction. Votes came in quick succession, 10, 15, 20. The tally climbed like a weight, finding its inevitable floor. Ambassador Senna Okafor sat at the compact's lowest-tier table, her hands folded on the polished stone in front of her. She had occupied that seat for 18 years, watching the sovereignty file itself deeper into its own bureaucracy with each session. 22 years in diplomatic service before that. 14 years before that as a structural engineer on Earth's orbital platforms, watching pressure systems, understanding what happened when the load on a foundation shifted. She knew what a stale file looked like. She knew what it meant when nobody asked it to update. She set down her mug, ceramic, chipped on the handle today's mug, without looking at it. She did not reach for a stylus. She did not lean toward her attaché. She did not object to the motion on the floor. The junior compact delegate, Riv Sallow, watched her hands. In 18 years, he had never seen Senna Okafor sit silent through a reclassification motion. Not once. "Aren't you going to object?" he whispered. Okafor's 2 fingers tapped the table. Twice. Always twice before she spoke. "What would I object to?" she said, her voice flat. "The record is 8 years old, and nobody's asked it to update. That's exactly what it is." Riv straightened back in his chair. He did not understand what she meant. Neither did anyone else in the chamber. But behind her, 3 delegations deeper in the amphitheatre, Elder Tovrin of the Corivane felt something. A vibration, faint, not audible, felt through the glass floor beneath her feet. The kind of tremor that only registered if you'd spent 200 years learning to listen for things other species didn't bother to feel. Tovrin's ear frills flattened slightly, a gesture of attention the humans would have called a frown. The Corivane were an ancient species, pre-sovereignty by 3 centuries, observers of the council rather than drivers of it. They had learned early that silence had value. They had learned later that listening was a weapon. Tovrin did not alert her delegation. Not yet. 35 in favor, Vren announced. Her sensor lens whirred slightly as it tracked the remaining delegations. Delegate Merk of the Vex's hand voted yes, his crystalline form refracting the ceremonial light in agreement patterns. The Vex's hand always followed the Pelurin's lead. The Pelurin had resources the smaller species could not refuse. 36, 37. Vren's gaze moved across the amphitheater, tallying. In 27 years of wardenship, she had reversed a public decision exactly 0 times. The sovereignty did not tolerate weakness in its leaders. The record had been filed. The record was fact. The record was unchanging. But something in her sensor lens picked up a faint thermal variation in the floor's substrate. A microsecond of data, insufficient for analysis. She compensated automatically, dismissing it. 38 in favor, she said. The motion is now formalized. Upon final vote confirmation, the compact seat shall be reclassified to non-participant status, effective. I need a recess, Okafor said. The chamber stilled, not because a recess was unusual. They happened every session, scheduled breaks for delegation coordination, for checking remote authorities, for the endless negotiation that kept the sovereignty running. But because Senna Okafor had never requested one mid-vote, she had never interrupted a Vren proceeding. She had sat in silence for 18 years, and now, with the outcome decided and the record moving, she asked for time. Vren's hand, still raised, still poised, twitched slightly. The first visible hesitation anyone in the chamber had witnessed in 27 years. Reason, Vren asked. To update one filing, Okafor said. 90 seconds should suffice. The High Warden looked at her. Really looked, the way someone looks at a door that should have been locked but isn't. For a moment, nothing moved in the Sovereign Hall except the light refracting through the delegation's various forms. The Pelurin's scaled shoulders, the Torvan's rippling chromatic patterns, the Coravain's subtle ear frills. Vren's sensor lens cycled twice, scanning Okafor's vital signs. Heart rate steady, body temperature nominal. The woman was not afraid. She was not excited. She was exactly as still as she had been every session for 18 years. Which meant something was already in motion. Granted, Vren said finally. 90 seconds. Okafor stood during the recess without looking at anyone. The floor beneath her did not move yet, but she had been waiting for this moment for 6 years. The moment when the sovereignty would overreach by exactly one vote and give her the window to transmit. She walked to the edge of the compact delegation section, where Fleet Liaison Anders Dre sat motionless in the third chair back, the position he had occupied for every session for 6 years without speaking once. Dre had the kind of face that made him disappear in crowds, medium height, moderate coloring, nothing remarkable. He looked like a junior attaché. He looked like someone who had never commanded a starship. He looked like, exactly, what the sovereignty needed to ignore. She passed him a slip of paper with a single phrase written in characters no one watching would recognize. Not compact script, something older. Something from the structural engineering days when humans still built things by hand and marked them in ways that could not be transmitted over open channels. Dre's fingers moved to a sealed device at his collar, the kind compact officers carried, but the sovereignty had never asked to inspect. The transmission took 4 seconds. By the time Okafor resumed her seat and picked up her mug, the order had reached Calder's reach on a tight beam frequency that the sovereignty's sensors would read as ambient radiation, and Threshold 9 had begun waking from hibernation. 67 meters beneath the Sovereign Hall's floor. The ship had been there for 12 years, hidden during the construction of the hall's new foundation layer, buried by contractors who asked no questions and were paid in currency that left no trace. 8 years ago, when the compact certification came back as disarmed, nobody had bothered to update the records. Why would they? A disarmed species was not a threat. A disarmed species did not need surveying. But the compact had never stopped building. They had just stopped letting anyone see it. Elder Tovrin felt the change immediately. Not a vibration this time, a shift in the resonance pattern of the glass itself, the way stone sang when something massive moved inside it. Her delegation sat in the smallest delegation block, barely 30 seats from the floor's center edge. The Coravain had always preferred seating that was close to observation points. It was why they noticed things. She stood slightly, just enough to catch the eye of the youngest Coravain delegate, Melis Orsh, seated 2 tiers below her. She made a small gesture, not a wave, just a tilt of her head toward the floor. The kind of movement that looked like discomfort, the kind that did not raise alarms. Melis understood. Her people had listened to the Coravain for centuries. Listening was genetic by now. She signaled the others, not in words, in the precise positioning of her body, a shift in her seating that meant something was coming. 2 minutes, maybe less. Something was rising through the glass. Vren's gavel came down. The recess had ended. The vote reconvened. The tally stands at 38 votes for reclassification, she announced. The motion will be entered as formal record, effective upon my final. The floor hummed. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was the sound of a massive system initializing after years of dormancy, the kind of low-frequency drone that most humanoid ears could barely catch. But Vren's sensor lens picked it up as a vibration traveling up through her ceremonial platform. She stopped mid-sentence. Her hand had been moving toward her collar, the gesture, the one she always made before finalizing a ruling. The gesture that had preceded 27 years of decisions no one had ever reversed. This time, her hand stopped. Not slowly, not dramatically. It simply froze, 3 centimeters short of the obsidian beads, her palm suspended in the air like she had forgotten what her own body was supposed to do. The amphitheater fell silent. 40 delegations watched a woman who had never once faltered in public discover that something was moving beneath the floor she had walked on for her entire wardenship. The hum deepened. It was coming from below, not from the ceremonial systems, not from the hall's environmental grid. Something else, something that had weight. Delegate Hask half rose from his seat, an instinctive movement he could not complete before the floor itself drew every eye downward. The glass slab began to vibrate, not tremor, not quake, but a precise, controlled resonance traveling along a seam no record had ever logged, a seam that should not exist. Vren's sensor lens compensated automatically, shifting to full spectrum. For 3 seconds, the information did not parse. Her eye was picking up something underneath the glass, something massive, something metal, something that had been there long enough to leave thermal signatures in the stone. The compact certification said disarmed. The compact certification had not been updated in 8 years. Her hand dropped away from her collar entirely. The seam widened, not cracking, opening, the way a door opens when the hinges have been oiled and waiting. The edge of a vessel began to show, its hull scarred with 8 years of exposure to the electromagnetic field that powered the hall systems, its registry markings 8 years out of sync with every sovereignty file. Threshold 9. The name hit Vren's visual database like a collision. A ship, a compact ship, reported as decommissioned at Calder's Reach 8 years prior, sitting in that moment between rising through the floor and becoming undeniable. The compact's hidden battleship rose through the floor without a sound beyond the groan of fused glass redistributing its weight. Its hull was scarred, but intact. Its weapon bays were sealed, but only because they were full. The registry markings along its prow were clear enough to read. A list of armaments that should not exist, maintenance records that said the ship had been active for every single day of the past 8 years, certifications that contradicted everything the sovereignty's files claimed. And in the moment before it cleared the opening, Vren's eye caught the weapons array still secured in their bays. The array that her certification said did not exist, had been decommissioned, had been disarmed. 40 delegations watched a floor that had never opened open. 40 delegations watched authority fail. Her hand reached for her collar again, the gesture that meant authority, the gesture that meant certainty. This time, it stopped before it began. Okafor's mug sat untouched on the table, the first one in 22 years that had not needed breaking. The broadcast came through the ship's open channel with no preamble, no declaration, no threat, just the voice of a compact officer, clipped and official. Fleet designation Threshold 9 requesting updated certification survey. Current records on file are 8 years dormant, standing by for new assessment. Then silence. It was the silence that broke things. A threat would have triggered protocols. A demand would have activated procedures. Weapons fire would have triggered the emergency defensive grid. But a request, a formal, procedural, unarmed request from a ship that officially did not exist, created a vacuum that no sovereignty protocol had ever addressed. Vren's hand remained suspended in the air, 3 centimeters from her collar. The gesture she had not completed. The one she could not complete now without acknowledging that her foundation had shifted beneath her. The amphitheater erupted in what looked like stillness. 40 delegations did not move. They simply relocated their attention. Eyes that had been tracking the vote began tracking Vren. Eyes that had been tracking Vren began tracking Okafor. The compact ambassador sat perfectly still, her hand touching her untouched mug. Delegate Hask of the Pelurin stood again. His scales flickered with stress coloration, a sign he could not suppress. The Pelurin had voted for this reclassification. The Pelurin had been confident the motion would pass. The Pelurin had not accounted for a ship. Sarmal of the Torven opened her mouth 3 times without speaking. Her chromatic patterns, the evolutionary tells that betrayed emotion in her species, shifted from blue to deep purple. Fear yellow was creeping in at the edges. Murk of the Vex's hand's crystalline form went still, all internal light ceasing. A Vex's hand that stopped refracting was a Vex's hand that had stopped thinking. The shock was total. Delegate Kesran of the Coiled, a being made of segmented chitin and predatory calculation, leaned forward, processing. The Coiled had been part of the vote. The Coiled had been wrong. Kesran's mandibles clicked rapidly, the sound of a species running calculations at the speed of thought. Riv Sallow, the junior compact attaché, whispered something to Anders Dre. Dre did not respond. He was watching Vren watch the floor, the way a hunter watches prey that does not yet realize it is prey. The motion, Vren said carefully, will require clarification. Her voice had changed, not shaking, never shaking, but flatter, more careful, the voice of someone who was speaking through a tactical restriction she had never encountered before. She tried again. The certification filed. She stopped. The survey was conducted by. She stopped again. Vren's sensor lens cycled through spectra, searching for a data string that would give her authority. The ship's registry was clear. The weapons were documented. The timeline was irrefutable. 8 years ago, the compact had been certified disarmed. 8 years ago, Threshold 9 had been reported as scrap. But Threshold 9 was not scrap. Threshold 9 was rising through the floor. And Vren's hand had stopped mid-motion, the gesture that meant authority now meaning nothing. Okafor stood. She did not raise her hand. She did not ask for recognition. She simply stood in her lowest-tier seat and waited for the hall to notice. When it did, when 40 delegations had rotated to face her, she spoke with the same flatness Vren had used. I request the reclassification motion be withdrawn pending updated survey data. 1 sentence, no elaboration, no explanation. The exact opposite of how delegation procedure operated. A request without justification was a request a high warden could dismiss outright. But Vren's hand had stopped mid-motion. The gesture was incomplete. The authority was fractured. Vren's hand finally moved, but not to her collar, to her stylus. She picked it up the way someone picks up something very breakable. She set it down again without writing anything. That request, she said, requires deliberation. Deliberation, not I deny, not I grant. A word that meant she was no longer certain of her authority to decide. Elder Tovrin rose, all the way up, a full standing position at her section's front rail. The motion rippled through the Corrivain delegation like a warning. Tovrin of the Corrivain did not stand in the Sovereign Hall during session. Tovrin of the Corrivain sat in the back tiers and said almost nothing. She had occupied that seat for 73 years, and in all that time she had spoken in formal chamber perhaps 4 times. I noticed the vibration, she said. Her voice was dry, elderly, carrying the weight of someone for whom silence was a choice, not a default. 11 minutes before anyone else looked down. The floor was changing trajectory a long time before it opened, which means this ship has been accelerating beneath your feet since before the compact sat for this vote, possibly since before the reclassification was called. Silence. The certification does not account for that, Tovrin continued. The 8-year survey cannot, because the survey was not asked new questions. She sat down, but her statement hung in the amphitheater like a physical thing. The Coravain did not make mistakes about observation. The Coravain did not speak unless they had evidence. Tovrin had heard the vibration for 11 minutes before anyone else, which meant the ship had been waking for 11 minutes, which meant someone at the compact table had known exactly when to request a recess. Which meant this was not a surprise, it was a plan. Vren's sensor lens whirred as it shifted spectrum, processing data the way a thinking creature processes thought. Okafor watched the warden's left eye cycle through visible light, infrared, electromagnetic, searching for a reading that would tell her something her authority could use. There was nothing to find. The ship was still rising through the floor. The opening had already happened. Vren tried to speak. Her hand moved to her collar. This time, she forced it through. Her fingers touched the obsidian beads, the first time she had completed that gesture since the floor began to open. But the gesture meant nothing now. The chamber will convene a formal review of the certification in question, she said. Her voice was breaking up, audio glitching in a way a warden's voice never did. The vote on reclassification is hereby suspended, pending updated assessment of the compact's status. Not a retreat, not yet, but a step backward, and everyone in the amphitheater heard it. Delegate Kessrin's mandibles opened fully, a gesture of interest in the coiled species. She was seeing an opportunity. She was seeing weakness. Hask sat down completely, his scales going flat. The Pelurin had backed the wrong motion. The Pelurin had backed a reclassification that had collapsed the moment a ship rose through the floor. Murk of the Vex's hand's crystalline form began refracting light again, relief in measured blue patterns. The Vex's hand had voted yes, but the Vex's hand could claim they had been following procedure. The Vex's hand could reposition. Samil of the Torvin stood. Her chromatic pattern settled into a careful neutral, the colors of someone who was about to vote against their own vote. I move to table the reclassification motion indefinitely, she said. Second, came a voice from the Pelurin delegation. Hask, repositioning. The motion is tabled, Vren said. Her voice had flattened completely now, the warden cadence entirely gone. Unanimously, all in favor. Every hand went up. 40 delegations voting to undo their own vote. 40 delegations voting to pretend the last hour had not happened, or at least to pretend they had not been part of it. Only Okafor had known from the beginning that the vote did not matter. The floor did not care about votes. The ship did not care about procedure. The record cared only that it was being asked a new question after 8 years of silence. And questions once asked could not be unasked. Okafor stood. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for the chamber's attention to reset. She simply walked from her lowest tier seat toward the exit with the pace of someone who had always known the floor would open. Her mug was in her hand, ceramic, chipped on the handle, whole. The first one in 22 years. She had not broken herself. As she walked, the chamber's doors began to open. Not because anyone ordered them, because the automated systems, faced with a command they did not recognize from a warden who was no longer commanding, defaulted to standard protocol. When a delegation stands, the doors open. Delegate Hask of the Pelurin half rose, then sat. Samil of the Torvin opened her mouth without speaking. The chamber did not erupt. It simply shifted. 40 delegations turned inward, reaching for their communication devices with the understanding that had arrived with the open floor. The floor opened, the ship rose, Her authority fell. Three things happening at once. Three things that had been separate until the moment they were not. Vren's hand dropped completely. It fell to the lectern, and she did not raise it again. She sat down. In 27 years of wardenship, Cecily Vren had never sat during a session. The High Warden stood during proceedings. The High Warden maintained position. The High Warden commanded from height. But Vren sat, and the symbolism was total. Elder Tovrin of the Corrivain watched from her small delegation block. She had been right about the vibration. She had known something was changing beneath the floor. She had known that a ship was rising, and she had said nothing until the moment was right, because that was what the Corrivain did. They waited. They observed. They spoke only when silence would have been a lie. But she had not known, could not have known, that watching someone lose their certainty could be as violent as watching a floor split open. The Corrivain had believed in records. They had believed that things written down were true. They had lived for 200 years with the sovereignty because order was valuable, because hierarchy was functional, because certainty was the price of peace. But certainty had just died on the floor of the Sovereign Hall, and Tovrin understood something that no young species would understand for centuries. A record stops being a fact the moment someone asks it a new question. Threshold 9 hung suspended in the open floor. Its weapons arrays were still sealed, still dormant, still full. The ship made no demands. It issued no ultimatums. It simply waited, and its waiting was more powerful than anything the sovereignty's defenses could have countered. Because weapons could be fired and defended against. Procedures could be activated and countered. But a ship that had been disarmed according to records that were not, could not be countered by anything except the admission that the records were wrong. And Vren could not admit that. Vren's entire authority depended on never being wrong in public. But she had been wrong for 8 years, and everyone in the chamber now knew it. By the time Okafor reached the threshold, the point where the Sovereign Hall's ceremonial light gave way to the corridor beyond, every major delegation had filed a resurvey request on their communication channels. The emergency channels lit up with Priority 1 queries. Update records, Dolvin Reach Survey, compact classification. Urgent, cross-reference certification protocol, all species, past 8 years. Emergency audit, Calder's Reach decommissioned status verification. The sovereignty's 8-year-old files were no longer settlement. They were questions, and questions once asked could not be unasked. Okafor did not stop. She did not turn. She kept walking, her mug held level, the way someone carries something they have been granted permission to keep. The doors closed behind her. The floor beneath the Sovereign Hall remained open. The ship, Threshold 9, registry out of sync with truth, weapons still sealed, hung suspended in that space, not attacking, not threatening, simply waiting for the sovereignty to understand what had been true all along. Vren sat alone on her judgment platform, her hand lowered, her collar undecorated by the gesture that had meant authority. Her sensor lens cycled endlessly through the spectra, searching for a reading that would make sense, a data point that would return her to certainty. There was none. Behind her, the opening floor. Below her, the risen ship. Around her, the sound of protocols failing, of certainty collapsing, of a record that could not be defended anymore. The warden cadence, that measured half-octave that had preceded every ruling for 27 years, did not return to her voice. It was gone. She had used it for the last time when the floor opened. Delegates filed toward the exits, their minds already moving to the next crisis, the next reclassification, the next vote that would have to be reconsidered in light of this precedent. Once the sovereignty had asked one question, all the files became vulnerable. All the certainties became contingent. The Corrivain delegation stood in formation, Tovrin at their head. She did not look back at Vren. There was nothing to see. A leader who could not lead, an authority that had collapsed, a record that had stopped being true. As they left, Tovrin caught Melis Orsh's eye, a single glance that said, This is what happens when the record is not asked new questions. This is what happens when certainty forgets to listen. 40 delegations had voted for a reclassification that would have erased the compact from the sovereignty's hierarchy. 40 delegations had believed in a record that had not been updated in 8 years. 40 delegations had been wrong all at once, and everyone knew it. Okafor walked through the corridors of the compact's quarter, her mug still whole, still untouched, still unbroken for the first time in 22 years. She did not stop to check on the compact's other stations. She did not file reports or send confirmations back to Earth. She simply walked, her mug held level, understanding that patience had just become the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. Because patience that looks like surrender, when combined with a hidden ship, when combined with silence that was actually strategy, when combined with 18 years of saying nothing at all, that kind of patience could remake the sovereignty's understanding of itself. The flaw had been there the whole time, so had the ship. The only thing that changed was who finally looked down. And once someone looked down, once the question was asked, once the record was required to update itself, the sovereignty's entire architecture became contingent. Every file, every certification, every ruling made on the basis of information that had not been re-asked in 8 years was now suspect. The cascade had begun. In the Sovereign Hall, Vren sat at her lectern, alone, her sensor lens dark, her hand resting on the stone, her collar heavy with 27 years of beads, each one representing a decision she had never reversed. Until now. She did not reverse the decision. The vote was tabled. The motion was withdrawn. The procedural retreat was complete. But she had sat down, and a high warden who sat was a high warden who had fallen. The door to the chamber closed. Behind it, the open floor. Below it, the risen ship. Around it, the sound of an institution discovering that certainty is just another word for not asked enough questions. The compact had not fired a shot. They had just opened a flaw. And everything the sovereignty believed about disarmament had collapsed into the gap beneath.